Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I get stuck in a rut where I feel like everything I'm designing uses the same patterns and layouts, just kind of recycled over and over with new fonts and colors. So I wanted to do a little bit of an experiment this weekend where I redesigned one of my existing pages on my agency website using a style that I've never touched before, just to kind of stretch my creative muscles and see what I could come up with. So I ended up coming up with this design that's kind of like in the brutalist style, something way different than what my website looks like now, and unlike anything I've really designed before. Now, I'm not looking to rebrand my agency with this completely different look, but it was a really useful exercise in just kind of helping me get outside of the box and think of some different layouts and ideas. And what struck me is all these things that I'd never really designed before, I've never really built these out either. So I thought it might be interesting to go along the journey as I try to build this site out using some techniques that maybe I don't use on every build. Just looking at this site, it's a really structured grid system, so I know we're going to be taking advantage of CSS Grid here. And of course, there's a lot of little design accents that I think we can use pseudo elements to knock out. So if this sounds interesting to you, then stick around and let's see what we can do. So what I think we'll start with here is what I'm calling kind of the hero section. That includes this big image at the top, as well as the headline and all the text and this first button down here. Now there's a few things to note here. Here on this hero image, you can see it has a nice little texture on it. I achieved that by just adding this little texture layer on top of it. This is a motif that I plan on reusing throughout this page, so I want to make sure to set up a system where I can automatically add this overlay on top of all the images. And if we turn on our guides here to help us, we can see that everything's really structured to the grid. We can see our header here lines up right with these grid lines. Our image lines up with the grid. This text lines up with the grid here and spans so many columns wide. And then this text underneath it spans a different set of grid items, even with its children going in here and spanning to the grid as well. So we might actually be able to introduce using Subgrid in this first section as well. And then of course we just have a button here at the bottom. And it might be a little bit harder to see on the screen share, but we do have this accent line that goes above our body copy here inside of this section. So we're probably going to have to use some kind of pseudo element here that starts right on our grid line and then spans all the way across the page, kind of falling off the end. So hopping over here into WordPress, I am using my starter site, so we'll probably take advantage of some of the built-in classes and things like that that are already in that starter site. And if you want to catch up on that, I do have a video on it. I've also gone ahead and added all the colors and typography. That way you didn't have to sit through watching me do that. And lastly, I've gone ahead and added that header to the page. Since that's a pretty simple header, I just threw in a logo and a button. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead and get a section on the page. So I'm going to use / and type in section. This is just a pattern that I've saved inside my website that just goes ahead and gives me a section, which is a container that I've gone ahead and switched over to a section tag and a wrapper inside of it. And this section has some padding and things on it just to get me started. Now, if we remember back to the design, we have a big image inside of this and it goes all the way to the top of the page. So I know we're going to have to go ahead and zero out this top padding. I'm just going to do everything here at the default classes that GenerateBlocks gives us rather than spend a bunch of time creating classes and naming everything. Since this is just a demo, I don't think it's really necessary. Of course, if this was an actual build that I was doing, I would want to make sure to put classes on everything so I could reuse it throughout the site. Now for this image, it's really more decorative than anything. I don't think it gives any context to the page, so I think we can actually go with a background image here. So I'll go ahead and make sure that I have that wrapper selected. We'll go in here to the backgrounds and we'll add a new background image. I've gone ahead and uploaded all this media to the library so we can go ahead and get that placed in there. Now obviously it has no height yet, so we need to give this some kind of dimension. So what I typically like to do for these situations is use aspect ratio. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 16:9 just to give us a place to start with. I think this is a little bit too tall for the desktop version, so maybe I'll just back this down to maybe 16/6. Obviously, I could reduce that fraction down here, but we're just kind of experimenting to see how this works. Let's go ahead and save those changes. And we'll take a look at it here on the front end where we can jump into the inspector and see how this looks at all the different breakpoints. So here on desktop, this looks pretty close to what we had inside Figma, but as we shrink this down, we can see the image gets smaller and smaller, which looks pretty good. Now, when we get down here to mobile versions, this actually might be a little bit too narrow. So what we could do is jump back in here into our wrapper and just give this image a minimum height. Maybe we start with something like 300 pixels. That's not going to affect our desktop version because the aspect ratio is actually making that image taller than that, but it should affect on mobile where it's getting just a little bit too narrow. We'll go ahead and save that and refresh here, and you can see now it's quite a bit taller. So what this is going to do is it's going to allow it to grow to that 16:9 proportion. But as we shrink this down, once it hits that 300 pixels tall, it's just going to stop shrinking in height. We can see right there it happened. And that way it never gets too skinny on the mobile versions. I think that's a good place to get us started there. So next, let's think about how we're going to do this image overlay. We could go ahead and add another layer to our background here, but I want to be able to control the blend mode of this overlay, so I think we're going to need to use a pseudo element. So since I know we're going to be using the same image treatment with this little grungy overlay thing on multiple things on this page, I am going to go ahead and give this a class. We'll just go in here and add a new class, and I'll call it image-overlay, and we'll go ahead and hit create. Now, since this is going to be an absolutely positioned pseudo element, I want to go ahead and make sure that this wrapper is set to a position of relative. So we'll scroll down here until we get to our position. And we'll change this from default to relative. And now we can go in here and actually create our pseudo element. We'll go ahead and grab the before pseudo element, which will work just fine. And we need to scroll down to the bottom, and inside our content field, just put in 2 empty quote marks. That will just give us blank content here since we're going to be filling it with a background image. Now we can go up here to our position. We're going to set this to absolute. We're going to link all those inset values together and set them to 0. This will just make sure that our pseudo element is completely covering this image. And I can actually show you it's doing that if I just go in here and add a background color. You can see that this pseudo element, which we've now colored red, is covering up that entire image, which is perfect. We'll go ahead and clear that out. And instead of a background color, we want to go ahead and add a new image. So we'll go into our media library here, and I've already uploaded this image overlay. We'll go ahead and add that to the page. Now, since this is completely opaque, it's covering our image, but we can use the mix blend mode to go ahead and change that to match the effect we had inside of Figma. In Figma, I actually use the color burn effect, which is just gonna overlay that image and give us some transparency, and it really boosts up the contrast here, which is something that I think looks really good with this style of design. So let's go ahead and save those changes again. We'll refresh everything on the front end here, and we'll just test everything out to make sure it's still looking good at all of our different device sizes. I think that image kind of shrinks down nicely, so I would say that is perfect for this first little part of the section. So hopping back into Figma here, let's go ahead and turn our attention to all this text. So what I'm picturing is we have some kind of wrapper that goes around this text. Go ahead and hide that fill and just give this a nice bright red stroke so we can see what we're doing. We'll have some kind of wrapper around this big headline here, and then we can do another wrapper that goes around this text here and includes that pseudo element. Again, I'll just go ahead and hide that so we can see what we're working on. So we'll have these 2 different containers, but the interesting thing here is these containers need to line up perfectly on these grid lines. So if we remember back to how we count CSS grid lines, we have 1 starting here, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this first container is going to span from column 1 to column 8. And then here for this other container, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's going to start on 5 and span all the way across here. Actually, it looks like it stops here. So it's going to go from 5 to 12. So that gives us kind of an idea of how we're going to span these columns. But if you look at this text inside this second one here, we can see that this text fits inside of this first area here, maybe these first 3 columns. And then this other text, as well as the button, kind of spans the other part of this grid. So we can actually set this container that we add to the website here to Subgrid, and that way we'll be able to take these child elements and place them directly on the main parent grid here. That might be a little bit confusing, but as we dive in and start building this out, I think it'll all make sense. Of course, we'll have to add this pseudo element as well, and that's something we can probably just attach to this container here. So let's go ahead and jump back into WordPress. Back inside of our section, we'll go ahead and add our 2 new containers we need. So I'll add that first one, and I'll use my keyboard shortcut just to make a second one here. Now we want this to be like our default wrappers in the sense that it needs to conform to our website's content width and have the margin set to auto. All of that in my starter site is controlled by a class called wrapper. So I'll go ahead and just make sure that I have that wrapper class on both of these. And like I said, that just sets the max width to their site's max width and puts an auto margin on both the left and right. Now in this first one, we have a bit of text. Go ahead and use a headline block here, and I'll just copy and paste this in. And now we need to see how we get it aligned into our grid. Now, first things first, this is obviously too close together. I do have my sections set to a display of flex, so that gives us the ability to add a row gap here. I'm going to start with something maybe like 80 pixels of row gap, just to get these things kind of spaced away from each other. Now on these containers, I want to use that same grid I used inside of Figma. So let's go ahead and add a new class. And this is something we're gonna have to use on all of the elements that are gonna be controlled by this grid. So I'm just gonna call this grid-12-column. So we know that we're using our 12 column grid for this. I'll go ahead and hit start editing. Now inside the layout, we're gonna change this to a display grid. We'll go ahead and set up a 12 column grid here. I just grabbed one of these by random out of here, and I'm going to change this to repeat 12 instead of the repeat 5. Now we did have a column gap on here. I'll change that to 16 because that's what was inside my Figma file. And just to be safe, I'll put a 16 pixel gap on the row as well, just so we have that kind of built into this helper class. Now, as I was annotating everything in Figma, I actually wrapped this headline inside of a container. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing here. So now we have our wrapper. We'll go ahead and rename this wrapper. And then we have our container here, and this is gonna be another wrapper. So we'll go ahead and name that just so it's easy to know what we're talking about. Now this container is just living inside of this wrapper's grid now. By default, it's only gonna take up one cell, but of course that doesn't look great. If we remember back to our design, we actually need this to span multiple columns. So what I'm going to do is go into layout here, and under the grid layout and under grid column, we can either tell this a stopping and starting point. If I remember right, that was 1/9, or we can just tell it how many columns to span by doing span 8, and that will make sure that it's spanning 8 columns inside of our grid. Now, both of those options have pluses and minuses. I think for this one, since we just have a single container with a single headline inside of it, this span trick works pretty well. So we'll just leave this at span 8. Now our second container here needs to go from 5 to 12, so we are going to have to be explicit about how we set that up. So with this wrapper selected, I'll go ahead and give it that same class we had for our grid column. So I'll just start typing in grid here, and we see grid 12 columns. That's going to set up our grid inside this wrapper, and we can add our container inside of here. Now again, by default, it's just going to span this first grid item, but if we go into layout and under grid columns, we can tell this to go from 5 to 12 by doing 5/12, and that's going to make sure that this spans from column number 5 all the way to column number 12 over here, which is just one shy of our website content width, so that's perfect. Now inside of that, we're going to have 2 columns of text. Just to be safe, in case there's ever multiple lines of text, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap those texts in a wrapper here. So I'll do the first one for our headline that was kind of on the left, and a second one for our body copy that was on the right. Now let me go ahead and copy and paste all that information into the page. So I've got all this content in here now. This first container is holding this headline, which is gonna be on the left, and the second container is holding all the text and the button that will be over on the right. But we need to figure out how to get those inside those exact columns that we had inside of our Figma file. So I'm going to go to this container here that's holding everything, and we're going to set this up as Subgrid. To do Subgrid, all we do is change this to a display of grid, and inside the grid template columns, we just type in Subgrid. Now, each one of these items, these 2 containers that are inside this wrapper, are going to adhere to that parent grid. So we can see they're using that 12 column structure. Now we just need to tell each one of these cells where to live on the grid. So this first one here, we can just go into our layout, and like we did before, into grid column. And for this one, instead of giving it explicit grid numbers, which gets a little bit more tricky when you're using Subgrid, I'm just going to do span 3, and that will make sure that it's spanning 3 of those columns. And for our second one here, it's a little bit wider, and we're doing span 4 on it, and that will put these 2 right next to each other. So this gets us the general layout here, but I think there's a few semantics we need to take care of. Really, this strategic web design and development is the H1 of the page, so I'm going to go ahead and change this to an H1. That means that this headline that comes before it either needs to come after that H1, or we need to de-emphasize it in terms of its markup. I'm just going to change this to a div. It's really just a marketing heading and not so much an actual semantic heading. So if we change it to a div here, it's not going to have any semantic meaning. Of course, now the styling of these 2 things doesn't look great, but inside of my starter site, I have some helper classes that are going to fake these to make them look like our H1 or make them look like a paragraph. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that that heading is selected, and inside my global style, I'm going to type in H1, which is a class I put inside of my starter site that will just make sure that this looks like my H1 headline. We'll go ahead and add that class to it, and now we can see this is styled just like my H1s on the site. Now it looks like this might be spanning too far. We might have gotten a little carried away with this grid column. Maybe instead of span 8, it was span 7. We could always go back to our Figma file here and count. This is 1 column, 2 column, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So yes, it should have been 7 and I originally had it in there as 8. That looks a little bit better now. Now for our H1 here, this is actually styled more like a paragraph. It's slightly bigger than our default paragraph. And I actually have a helper class for that as well, which is just P large, which is gonna style this like our paragraphs, but make it slightly larger than our paragraph text. So just like that, we have this more semantically accurate where our H1 heading is this text that's gonna work better for SEO. And this text that's really just a marketing heading is big and will catch people's attention, but doesn't have any semantic meaning on the page. Let's go ahead and save those changes before we get to our responsive settings and our pseudo element, and we'll go refresh things on the front end and see how it's all looking. So far so good. I think this looks pretty great, but as we get down and get to smaller breakpoints, we can see the design starts to fall apart. Now, I didn't design any responsive designs inside Figma, so we're just gonna have to figure out what we want this to do. We'll go ahead and go to our 1024, which we know is the breakpoint for GenerateBlocks to get into tablet, and we can see what we want it to do here. So what I'm thinking here is maybe this headline needs to span a little bit further. Maybe we could even push it in from the edge a little bit. And then for this, since it's 2 columns, maybe we can make it fit that entire thing. I might be able to grab the grid inspector here. If we go ahead and grab that and turn the grid on, maybe we make this headline go from 2 here to 12 over here. So it doesn't go quite the full width of our image, but takes up a good amount of space in between it. And then we'll do the same thing for this down here, making it go from column 2 to column 12. So let's jump back into our designer here and we'll go down to our tablet breakpoint. So what we decided is that this container here that holds our big marketing headline should span from column 2 to column 12, and that will make it just slightly skinnier than the content width of our website, but still quite a bit bigger in this tablet version. So here inside of this grid that's holding our 2 column layout here, we'll go and do the same thing, 2 over 12. And that will make sure that it's spanning the same width of this headline here. Of course, we need to mess with these grid lines inside of this as well. So this one here, we had it as span 3. I think that still probably works okay. But now that we have some extra columns here, we need to actually make this span further. So let's see what we need to do to make it span the full width. 7 is going to put us right at the end of this grid here. In fact, if I go ahead and grab this container, you can see the outline. We can actually see that this is ending right at the right edge of that headline there, which is perfect. So let's go ahead and save those changes. We'll refresh it on the front end. I'll get rid of this little grid helper here. And now we can see from our desktop breakpoint here, as we get down to tablet, everything just kind of stacks nicely and still looks pretty good. Now we need to think about how this is going to look on mobile, which for GeneratePress is 678 pixels. It actually looks okay at 768, but as we get smaller, these things really start to get cramped, and this headline is looking pretty cramped too. I think once we get to mobile, we just want to make this fill up the entire content width, and then maybe we stack this headline on top of this text. So let's jump back into here. We'll go into our mobile settings, and we'll go inside this container that holds our headline. And in here, we're just gonna do grid column 1 over -1. That's gonna allow it to start at the first column and then just span all the way to the end. We need to do the same thing here for this grid. So back into layout, grid column, we'll do 1 over -1. And now those are able to span the full width. Of course, we want this headline and this text to stack now. So we can do the same thing to the containers that hold both of those. Go into the layout, and here we'll do 1 over -1. And for our other container with the text, again, 1 over -1, that will just allow it to span the full width of that structure. We'll go ahead and save those changes, refresh on the front end, and we can see here on a more realistic looking mobile device, everything is nicely stacked in between it. Maybe we tighten up that 80 pixels just a little bit, but I think we're getting pretty close here. Just to tighten up that 80 pixels, I'll go back to our section here and maybe we bring this down to something like 60. I don't want to get too close on this, partly because this design style has a lot of empty space in it, and partly because we still have to fit that pseudo element in here. So I think this is looking pretty good now to where we can start setting up that pseudo element. We'll jump back into the editor here, go back into our desktop mode, and let's go ahead and grab this grid that wraps all of this content here. And here's where we're going to create that line using a pseudo element. Now I know we're going to use the same style pseudo element on several things, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a class too. we're just going to call this line _top right. That just means that it's going to be a line, it's going to be at the top of the container, and it's going to go off to the right. That's just an easy way for me to remember this. We'll go ahead and start with a blank style. Again, I'm going to change this position to relative since we're going to be absolutely positioning that pseudo element. Now we can go in here and add our before pseudo element and hit create. And here we need to go down into the content once again and just do a double quote mark, which is going to allow us to have blank content. You can see that kind of screwed up our design, but as soon as we change this to a position of absolute, that will fix everything again. Now we can't really see our line while we're doing this, so we have to kind of imagine what we're going to be doing. Let's just go ahead and set a 0 for top and 0 for left, which is just going to start this pseudo element right at the top left corner of this grid. But we'll go ahead and set up our sizing and give this a background color so we can start to see it, and then we can play around with that placement. So I'll go in here into the sizing, and because I just want this to fall off the entire width of the website, I'm going to give this 100 VW, which will just make sure it's always as big as the screen. But since it's starting at this top left corner, it's just going to kind of go off the edge of the screen over here. Now it's just a 1 pixel border, so I'm going to give it a height of 1 pixel, and then we can go into the background and just give this our dark beige color here, and now we can actually see that showing up on the screen. In fact, just to make it easier, I'm going to make it black right now so you guys can see a little bit better, and then we'll change it back to the appropriate color once we get it positioned correctly. The left position is actually pretty good. All we want to do is just move this up quite a bit. Now we know we have 80 pixels in between this wrapper and this wrapper, and then once we get down to mobile, that changed to 60 pixels, so we just want to make sure we never interfere with those. So we'll go back in here and make sure we got our pseudo element selected again. I'll go back to our before, and what we're going to do is change this inset value for the top to a negative number. I'm going to start with something maybe like 24 pixels, which just kind of pushes it off the edge. I don't think that's quite enough, so maybe 32. We know that if this is 32 pixels off the top and there's 60 pixels in between these things on mobile, they're never going to collide with each other. In fact, we might just want to go with 30, even though that breaks my 8-point system. It will make sure that it's perfectly in the center once we get down to that mobile breakpoint and there's only 60 pixels of gap in between these two elements. So let's go ahead and change that background color back to our dark beige here just to make it a little bit more subtle. We'll go ahead and save these changes and test everything out on the front end. So now we can see our pseudo element is starting here on the left-hand side and then just running off the edge of the page here. And as we get down to our tablet breakpoint, we can see it actually broke our layout here. And that's happening because this pseudo element is causing some overflow on our page. Since we set it to be 100 VW or viewport width, it's wider than our actual container here, so we need to make sure to clip that off. So let's go back into our designer here. We'll grab our section and scroll down to our position, and we just want to set that X overflow, which is the horizontal overflow, to clip, and that will make sure to clip anything that overflows. We'll go ahead and save those changes and refresh on the front end. We can see now our design looks more like it was supposed to on tablet. And even though that this is overflowing on the edge, we can't scroll left and right because this is being clipped off by the section. So we know it looks good on desktop. It looks good on tablet once we change to this layout. And as we get down here to mobile where everything kind of fills up the space, it still looks great and it's perfectly positioned in between those two elements since we made it 30 pixels off the top of this and we have 60 pixels in between these two wrappers. So let's go ahead and review this and make sure we didn't forget anything. Here's our design in Figma. We have our big image up here and the way everything's laid out here on desktop. And if we flip back over here to the website, we can see it's pretty dang similar. Now I didn't pixel peep to make sure they were exact pixels, but everything's laying in that grid the same way it laid inside the grid in Figma, which is exactly what we were trying to achieve with this section. Now, if we go back into Figma, the reason the grid is so important here is for consistency across this entire page. I'm using this grid to align just about everything inside this layout, so I want to use the same grid across every section to make sure that things line up perfectly. We can see even for this section that we just created here, we have some stuff in the next section that's going to line up perfectly to that same grid. So by using the same grid template columns, that 12 repeated grid, we can make sure we line things up perfectly. Now I'm excited to build out the rest of these sections I designed in Figma, but I want to be conscious of just how long this video is getting. So I'd love to know down in the comments if this is something you'd like to see me continue. I could go ahead and record out these other sections so you can see exactly how I build out this entire page. If that's something you're interested in, let me know down in the comments below. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to make sure to catch the next one, hit subscribe and we'll see you then.